let us go ahead and get started. For the undergraduates, we hope you're enjoying this open writing assignment. As we have said before, when we say 3 to 6 pages, we truly, honestly mean that. You're welcome to write 3, you're welcome to write 6. We want you to use this as an exercise to begin thinking through these ideas. Any format is fine. You can do a close reading of what the text we've assigned. You can do more of a thought piece. You can do anything in between. We very much look forward to reading these and thank you in advance for doing them. On undergraduates, of course, we're not asking you to do this. However, we're asking you to be in the spirit of this, which is hopefully, as we begin today, jump across millennia and geographic regions to really try to begin wrestling with these ideas, and that will hopefully set you up for a lifetime of so wrestling. So, with that spirit, let us indeed jump across a few millennia and a geographical span to the next moment of our course. Thus far, we have been looking at the western end of Eurasia, looking in particular at Christianity, the extraordinarily powerful ideas emerging in Christianity. Of course, we focused on love and infinity. We have discussed the ways these ideas were reread, reinterpreted, and often domesticated in perhaps not the most powerful ways, discussing the entire vision of the great chain of being in the Middle Ages, discussing the forms that this took in the early modern period, and the ideas that would later form what we now know as liberalism, where each individual becomes a very, very small deity with their own area of power, which is essentially their own possessions, and then with attempts made to work out the ways these little gods can deal with each other, either in terms of a marketplace, in terms of democratic forms of governance, where the little gods form interest groups, and in terms of larger utilitarian principles that would decide how you deal with issues that cut across what could be dealt with either in the marketplace or in democratic governance. And of course, we also discussed the yet further domestication of those ideas into the form of what we are calling school philosophy, perhaps the least powerful, in our opinion, ways of interpreting these ideas. And we began to point toward other possibilities that we will be returning to in a couple of weeks, and then again, at an even higher level at the very end of the course, where we ask, are there other ways we could read these ideas of love and infinity in powerful ways that would open up new possibilities? Today, we jump to another part of Eurasia, and again, jumping back a few millennia, as always, and you will see this as a theme in the course, intentionally going back to this extraordinary period in Eurasian history, which, just to remind you again, is roughly halfway through the first millennium BCE, going through about the 8th century of the Common Era. This is, we're calling it Age of Prophecy. We've got these initial religious philosophical movements midway through the first millennium BCE, and then a new, kind of even more radicalized often, version of them beginning in the first few centuries of the Common Era. This time, we will be looking at South Asia, looking in particular at the emergence of the Upanishads and Buddhism, and we too will be gesturing toward, and next week turning more directly toward, ways that these traditions have been reread in more recent times, and looking at the strengths and dangers of those rereadings. To set up this discussion, let me say a few words about some of the particularities of the way these larger themes and historical shifts are occurring in the South Asian context. So, as we have mentioned, across the board in Eurasia, you are seeing these Bronze Age states that lasted 2 to 3 millennia. Again, extraordinary how long these hierarchical social organizations can last. We've discussed again, of course, how these begin breaking down midway through the first millennium BCE, and these extraordinary philosophical and religious movements that emerge in opposition to these Bronze Age religions. If that's true in general, let me say a few words about the specificities of the South Asian case, because some of these concepts that arose and were then reinterpreted in the Upanishads and Buddhism will be central to the teachings. So, yes, you absolutely have Bronze Age states in South Asia, and these are deeply hierarchical, but let me say a few words about them. So the form that this took was in a series of positions. These terms would later come to be called a caste system, in which the highest level would be the Brahmin class. These would be the ones with religious authority. The next one down would be the Kshatriya class, which were the warriors, and then on down to the lower classes. As was true in all of these Bronze Age religions, that social organization was absolutely given at birth and unchangeable. If you were born into the Brahmin class, you were a Brahmin. If you were born into the Kshatriya class, you were a Kshatriya, and there you would remain. However, one variation that will turn out to be very significant was that in a much, much, much longer temporal arc, this was seen to be a, for lack of a better word, meritocracy, meaning that your position in this life, in one of those positions, was dependent on what you had done in previous lives. This was called the law of karma. Things that we do will have consequences, many consequences as we will see, but among those consequences is it will determine the birth status in your next life. So yes, if you're born a Brahmin, you will remain a Brahmin, but you are born a Brahmin because over the course of previous lives, you did such extraordinary things that you now deserve this rebirth as a Brahmin. I mention this because the law of karma is going to be very important for the reactions against the Bronze Age religions that will set in. Let me now turn to that. So, you will not be surprised to hear in the first millennium BCE, halfway through, these old Bronze Age religions come under strong attack, and yes, you know the story by now, you get these very strong philosophical and religious movements actively pushing against these Bronze Age religious ideas. The two ones that we'll be focusing on today are the Upanishads and the Buddha, roughly the same time as the emergence of Jainism and several other movements. So as always, we are picking and choosing which movements to discuss, and you are welcome to disagree with us. We do so because we think these are particularly powerful ones, but always feel free to bring in other examples that we simply, for lack of time, aren't going to bring up. Turning to those two. Both of these movements emerging, again, roughly 6th, 5th centuries BCE. This is going to be true across the board in Eurasia. The view was everything I just said was largely wrong, with some caveats. The opening move that all of these movements will claim is that absolutely every human being has access to divine truth. Everyone. And so it is not the case that only someone born into the Brahmin class has religious authority and someone born into a lower class does not. Absolute opposition to that view. Also, absolute, and this follows logically, of course, opposition to any kind of a view that one's current station in life is based upon some kind of religious justification that this is what you deserve. So you're born into a lower caste because you deserve to be there. A strong opposition and a strong claim accordingly that through training and cultivation, any human being from any class is capable of achieving full transcendence. That, of course, raises the obvious question. What are these forms of training? What is the vision of transcendence that is being called for in these religions? And, of course, returning to our major themes, what are their significance if we take them seriously? To do so, let me begin not by laying out the doctrines, we'll certainly get to those, but let me begin with a story. This is the story of the Buddha, and I do this for a very significant reason that will become clear as I go. Buddhism often works through stories, and we'll discuss later why that is the case. When you begin with doctrines, often you will miss part of the difficulty because no doctrine is ever going to be enduringly true. So let me begin with a story. We are again 6th, 5th centuries BCE, the exact dates are debated, and we are now in the northeastern part of South Asia, in what is now Nepal, and a king has a son. His son will, of course, is now a prince and will eventually, of course, be the king. And the king is, of course, extraordinarily wealthy and extraordinarily powerful. And he decides that his son should have the perfect life. He does not want his son to experience any suffering or to even know that suffering exists. That son's name is Siddhartha Gautama. And the king, the father, decides to set up for his son the perfect life. He will create a room in his palace in which servants will be working for Siddhartha all the time. And every single desire, every single wish he has at any moment, they will understand because they'll get to know him and they will immediately be there to give it to him. Moreover, the servants, must always know when at any point, for example, they're catching a little sniffle that might lead to a cold, because then they shouldn't enter the room. Another servant should, because Siddhartha should not even have to experience people getting sick. And what about the fact that it takes a while for a child to grow up, so the servants will get older over the course of his lifetime? No problem, because again, this is a very wealthy king. You have lots of servants, and as one of the sets of servants gets too old, you bring in younger ones. And so Siddhartha doesn't even know that people age. He has no sense of sickness, no sense of aging, and of course, no sense of wealth, and most importantly, therefore, no sense of poverty. He has no idea what goes into creating this world in which he grows up fabulously happy because every desire is being met. And then, however, Siddhartha, as he begins to get a little older, begins to notice that things just aren't quite right. Yes, every time he asks for something, the servants are always there to give it to him immediately, but he begins to notice the smiles are just a little bit too forced. And it dawns on him that sometimes a servant will be gone for a couple of weeks. Why are they not coming in? And it dawns on him that a servant seems to be getting changing a little bit over the years, and then suddenly he doesn't see them again. And it dawns on him that something must be going on that he's not allowed to see. So he finally goes to his father and says, "Father, I want to see what is outside these walls." And the father says, yes, the palace is yours. Let me walk you through the palace. And Siddhartha says, no, I want to leave the palace. I want to know what is outside the palace walls. So the king sends out his army and takes the main road leaving the palace, and the army goes out and cleans it totally. Anyone who is in poverty, they're immediately removed out of sight. Any building falling apart, and there are many falling apart because you can imagine what is being necessary to maintain the wealth to keep Siddhartha endlessly happy. All of that is immediately rebuilt. Anyone who is sick or aged is immediately moved out of sight as well. And then the king takes out Siddhartha, who gets to see this wonderful world of happy, smiling people. But he again notices that the smiles are a little too forced, and he begins actively looking around and noticing that actually slightly beyond sight, but just peer a little bit out, there seem to be falling down buildings and people who seem to be starving and aged and horribly sick. And immediately his father, the king, immediately draws him back. And Siddhartha says, no, I'm going out again. And he goes out again and forces the entire entourage to go a little bit further. And it becomes clear what is really going on. Not just that there is horrible suffering going on around him, but that the king, and therefore he, are living off of that suffering in order to create this perfect palace. Or, putting it the other way, that his wonderful world designed to fulfill his every desire exists by causing and creating incredible amounts of suffering to those outside. Realizing this, he decides he needs to leave. Leave meaning leave the palace, leave this extraordinary world designed for his happiness and pleasure, leave the future power that awaits him because he will be the future king, leaves, and you're lucky you're sitting down, his own family because by now he's married and has a child, and he decides he must leave all of this to find out what is really going on. He walks into his own family's room, looks at his wife and his child, and then leaves because he cannot stay in this. He leaves the palace, and he starts seeking great practitioners to help him learn the truth. And he finds some extraordinary ascetics who tell him the way to do it is so overcome the body that you will develop a completely, purely spiritual soul. So, he attempts this, undergoes incredible levels of asceticism, refusing to eat, horrible bodily mortification, to totally overcome his desires, which have been endlessly fulfilled all of his childhood. But he realizes, no, this is not leading to truth. And so he forgets all of these practitioners, and he decides he will sit under a tree, and he will meditate, and he will try to understand, and he will sit there as long as it takes. And he sits, and he sits. And slowly it becomes clear to him that what he has experienced is only an extreme example of what humans are like, period. The extreme example is he was born a prince, so his father could give him this extraordinary palace at a level that none of us could, but this is how we all live our lives. We live our lives trying to build these artificial worlds for our own happiness, to fulfill our own desires, to think that we are the kings of the world and everything that matters is ours, chasing fame, power, wealth. And as we do so, we are creating, and yet actively not noticing that we are creating, incredible suffering. Sensing this, he becomes increasingly horrified at not just his own life and what he has done and been an active part of. He was the one looking away when his servants, he began noticing, were getting a little sniffle. He also begins to see the horrible, horrible suffering of everyone around him. And he keeps sitting, and he begins to see earlier periods of his own lives in the past and previous eras that go back eons and eons. Because it turns out he begins to realize that this suffering isn't just a current moment, the suffering goes back endless eons, because all of the sufferings that we impose upon others create these consequences that then return and return and return and can continue for eons and eons and eons. Yes, resulting in these horrible hierarchies. However, the horrible hierarchies are not natural, they are not divine, they are a consequence of the horrible suffering we create by trying to create these artificial worlds. Seeing all of this and being horrified at the world of suffering that he has been an active part of creating, he achieves enlightenment. Don't worry, I'll come back to exactly what that means later, but I'm going to continue the story for now for reasons that will become clear. And achieving enlightenment, he immediately feels extraordinary compassion toward all living creatures who are having this incredible suffering in this world of created suffering. And he stands up from the tree and goes out to try to help us. He starts meeting a few others who become his disciples and start listening to his teachings. He teaches them what he has learned. They too begin the same forms of training to break the self that is so created to enhance our vision of power, wealth, and fame. They are taught the incredible suffering this creates, and it grows and grows and grows. This is the beginning of Buddhism. Now, let me go back to that enlightenment. and explain what it is that he finally sees, and the even words that are used to describe it. Adding this up, what he realizes is the following. It's not just, early on he was catching this first part, that we create a world of suffering. He realizes the deeper, horrible truth. We do this because we create a self that needs all of this. That is a construct. We create this sense that I am this self that requires endless power, wealth, and fame for me. As we create this self, we create an artificial world around us, exactly the world that he was, in part knowingly as he grew up, actively a participant of in that little room that his king, his father, had set up for him. This is what we all do. And when we create this artificial self, we create an entire artificial world around us to please ourselves and fulfill all of our desires. Those artificial worlds are fundamentally based on the creation of suffering of others, and we become horrifyingly good at literally not seeing the suffering we are causing. All of this, he realizes, is illusory. Now, let me immediately note that translation, which is in many ways, as we'll see, a good translation, has dangers in English. So by illusory, it doesn't mean, it doesn't exist. No. We do create these worlds, and in that sense, they do exist, and let me give you a sense of the depth to which they exist. When he began to realize this had been going on for eons, what he fully realized is the following too. This self we create and all of the suffering it forces on those around us, all of that continues. It is illusory. Again, we'll come back to what exactly this means. However, we construct it, and as such, it keeps coming back. The reason there is the law of karma is because we have, in a sense, created it. And the horrible consequences of our horrible acts that we literally don't even see cause these horrible consequences that will then continue. And among those are the fact that I, this self I have created, will continue to come back. Eons and eons and eons of lifetimes. The sufferings that I create, in other words, go on and on and on. You might think, well, in a world like this, at least at some point I'll pass away or be hit by a bus or what have you, and that will end my creation of suffering in the world. No, it will keep going. It will continue. And I will come back. Now, you're undoubtedly wondering many things, but let me begin with one of the points I begun to hint at. How am I coming back if all of this is illusory? His further understanding was the following. This is not real. We create it. It's constructed, but it is not real. There is no self. I do not exist in any true deep sense. I have created this thing, but what it means is this thing I've created is a construct through the suffering I am causing. There is no self. And what he realized, and therefore what he is teaching his disciples to do when they are meditating, is when you meditate, you are gaining the discipline to begin to break down this ego with a will, endlessly trying to fulfill its desires. You are breaking that down, and as you break that down, you come to see the world as it really is, an illusory world of artificial constructs created through these selves, endlessly inflicting suffering on everyone else. That is why, for the Buddha, as he finally realizes this, it brings out this extraordinary, universal compassion for all living creatures. Immediately, because once he sees that, he wants to save all living creatures. Now, I said I would say a few more words about even the word used for enlightenment. me now turn to that. The word is nirvana. Nirvana means an extinguishing. What is being extinguished? Well, all that I just mentioned, beginning with the self. If you can extinguish the self, you extinguish the will, the desires, and our acts that are creating this incredible web of suffering. You, in this constructed form that you have created, you cease to exist. So, to ask a question that the many stories will come back to, what happens when the Buddha stands up and starts teaching disciples? Well, one of the stories is he has achieved nirvana with remainder. The remainder being that Siddhartha still exists because of the remainder of all of that self that he had built up over the years. He is with remainder because he is choosing to maintain that remainder so he, out of this universal compassion, can help us. Were he, at that moment, realizing this to achieve full nirvana, it would be an act of selfishness, because then he couldn't help us. That is why he comes to us. That's one story. Let me tell you another story about what happens when he achieves nirvana. Another story is all of what I have told you, this story was done by the Buddha because he is trying to help us. And in fact, the Buddha had achieved nirvana eons ago, and he keeps coming back in a form that will help us to realize the truths of how we could live our lives. And he chose to take the form of Siddhartha Gautama, in other words, a prince born into such wealth and power he could never walk away from that, and he does so precisely to say to us, if I can walk away from this, you too can undergo the practices to break the self. In that reading, the Buddha continually returns out of that sense of compassion. He is trying to help us. You're already beginning to get a sense of the way these stories work, often contradictorily, and I'll come back to why they can be contradictory and why doctrinally that works, or putting it the other way, why the stories kind of in a sense override the doctrines. But before we get there, let me say a few words about the institutional form this will take once the Buddhist practices and ideas begin taking shape. So, relatively early on, over the next few centuries, and this is a Pan-Eurasian phenomenon, the same, of course, is happening in Western Christianity too, monasteries start being formed for those truly, truly extraordinary adepts who are practicing these teachings at an incredibly high level. Let me say a few words about the social world of these monasteries because it's very telling about the practice of Buddhism. So, to join a monastery, you must leave this world. You must reject your family. You must reject all of your societal duties. You join a monastery and you start undergoing incredibly strong, disciplined training, primarily through things like meditation, to break the self. These are difficult because breaking the self is not an easy, happy thing to do. I might add as a quick aside, we'll discuss later the domestication of some of these practices. One of those domestications exists in corporate America, where people are asked to do a quick meditation for 15 minutes as a kind of break to calm themselves down before they get back to work. And needless to say, if you're really doing these meditations, you don't get calm and go back to work very well. And this has actually become a problem in corporate America because even in those 15 minutes, if you're doing it enough, the techniques are pretty powerful and people begin really experiencing no self. And it can be incredibly difficult because you don't have a teacher there explaining, working you through this. It is an incredibly devastating experience because literally your entire reality is being broken. Everything you have lived by, you are in a sense, literally seeing to be illusory, and you are seeing a world without the self, without your ego, without all of your desires, without all of your will. It is an incredibly devastating experience. This is what you do in the monastery with teachers who are there actively working you through it. Then what happens as the no self begins to be realized? You begin breaking down the self. Well, going back to these stories, were you achieving this to then say, great, I'm going to head off to nirvana, I'm all free? No, that's the most selfish thing you could do, which would mean by definition you have not achieved nirvana. What do you do in a monastery if you're one of those few who, number one, can do this and do it so well that you begin to break the self? You then begin to feel universal compassion, which means the last thing you are going to do is leave. You then go out into the world and you act in ways to help those of us still suffering, which is the vast majority of humanity by definition, and you do it in ways that we could not, because you are by this point so spiritually potent. Let me give you some concrete examples of what this looks like in practice. So, you will go out, and if you think a king's policies are having a devastating impact, kind of the ways that Siddhartha himself was eventually coming to realize in terms of his own life and the way it was being led through the palace, if you see that, you must stop it. Number one, you cannot bow before a king. That will often cost you your life, and yet you can't. Because if you bow before a king, you are saying, I accept your authority. And you can only accept the authority of a figure who deserves that authority, and a horrible king does not. So you refuse to bow, and you will lose your head. But hopefully, by doing so, you are opening possibilities by those who will see we can stand up to this. A slightly more extreme example, of which there are many. You can go in front of the palace to stand up to the king. And if he doesn't cut off your head when you refuse to bow, you can self-immolate, meaning you set yourself on fire. Can you imagine? So you literally get into the meditative posture, and you set yourself on fire and don't move as you burn. And you would do this as an act of protest. Meaning, if I can do this, you, the king, must stop what you're doing. Let me give an even more recent example before I get to the larger point. Gandhi, who is not strictly a Buddhist, but he's coming very much out of these traditions as well as aspects of the Upanishads as well. This was the basic move of Gandhi's entire philosophy. So in overthrowing, we know in historical retrospect successfully, British rule of India, his argument was, we don't fight the British troops. Our acts are precisely to force the British to realize the suffering they are creating. And the goals of the movement was precisely to force the British to see it. So one famous example, the Indians needed salt, and the British controlled the salt trade, obviously. And so Gandhi would have his followers march up to ask for the salt and stand there as the British soldiers with the backs of their guns would beat them to the point often of either brain damage or death. And the practitioners just had to stand there as they were being beaten. Why? Because then the next day, in the London newspapers, everyone in London would have to open up the papers and see the British troops beating to death the Indians who were standing up for the salt. Meaning, you British might think your empire is liberating the world, spreading modernity to the poor heathens. This is what your empire really is. This is the empire. Your empire is based upon suffering. Look at it. Look. We're incredibly good at not looking. You need to look at it. And then Gandhi, when he decided at certain points that his followers weren't spiritually ready to do the full level necessary of the nonviolence, would actually stop the movement and say, we need to practice more meditation before we return. And as we know, it was extraordinarily successful. And not successful because they were violently overthrowing the British troops, it was successful because it forced the British to face the suffering they were creating. What is the larger point of this? The larger point is the following. Part of the power of Buddhism is the incredible, and I'll use a word we used before with Christianity, impossibility of following it. And yet we're called to do so. It, on the one hand, asks of us things that just seem impossible. I mean, how could this possibly be doable? And yet, the power of it is precisely to say, yes, of course it is impossible, and you must yet nonetheless strive to do it, because otherwise, everything we are doing, literally ourselves personally, and the social worlds we create, are based on suffering. And the more we recognize that, the more we will see it. The more we see it, the more we will be driven to compassion to help those around us. The more we see that, the more we realize yet more disciplined work must be done. Now, this does not mean all of us should immediately run to a monastery, because again, this is part of the power of it. We can't. If all of us right now decide, okay, I'm going to run to a monastery and yeah, that'll end the suffering, I mean, the monk would come out and say, give myself as an example, said, no, Michael, you're not ready. Like you're just doing this out of selfishness. You're doing this to get out of your workaday work and think you're going to be given free food in a monastery. Go back. You go back and try to be a good human being. And by being a good human being, hopefully, with proper meditation, you'll recognize how to begin the small steps toward being a compassionate human being. That will begin at the local level. You will slowly gain that sense of the suffering your life is creating. You will hopefully do more meditation, and maybe eventually, by which they will often say, in future lives, maybe you will be spiritually ready to do something so radical as to join a monastery, but you're not ready yet. So when I say impossible, the sense is none of us are going to be achieving nirvana for many eons of future lives. So there's no easy way out in this, and yet the sense is you better begin the process, because otherwise it's not just that you'll be creating suffering in this life, you'll create suffering that will last eons and eons and eons. The world that we know is a product of the suffering that we and those around us have been creating for eons of lives. It is an extraordinarily powerful vision, because it literally is saying you must break the self. That is almost impossible to do, and yet if you do not do it, you will be creating endless suffering, and yet to break the self, there's no easy way out. You begin now in this life, and maybe in many, many, many lifetimes to come, perhaps you will become spiritually potent enough to be able to truly, truly help those around you. It is an incredible vision, an incredibly powerful vision, and again, part of that power comes precisely out of the sense that, of course, this is possible, and yet we must try, because the failure means we will continue to create horrible suffering that we are endlessly failing to see. This was the initial vision. So let's turn to questions.
I have a question, Mike. So how would you describe the character of the emotion?
Yes.
You called it by the word in our language, compassion.
Yes.
But of course, there are no idealist emotions.
Yes.
So the emotion is seen through the lens of a metaphysical vision. So if the idea is an idea that asserts the illusory character of the self,
Yes.
of the division among selves, does that not change the character of the emotion?
Very much. And
So doesn't it not, for example, become a colder form of affect, more impersonal, more serene, more untroubled?
yeah, no, one of the many reasons, we'll come back to many of these, but one of the many reasons that Buddhism uses stories is precisely because of this. The view is no human terminology will capture this, no doctrine will capture this, no metaphysical vision will capture this. So getting back to the specific question here, think of compassion as a catch-all term, right? It's a catch-all term to give a sense of what it might mean, which none of us by definition could really understand at this stage in our development, but what it might mean if with a pure lack of ego, you were actively working on behalf of all living creatures. The point is, we could not understand what that would mean precisely because you said
There's a
we
moral
only live with
paradox,
egos.
right? There's a moral paradox because if you deny the division among selves, you feel that the evil thing is happening to you because you're part of the other self, right?
Well, yes, except right now, again, it's illusory, but we do create these worlds. So right now, I do exist. Now, I'm ultimately illusory, but I have created the self. And so at the moment, my actions, even were I to be devoting myself to spiritual practices, even so, I should be aware, even when I often think I'm being, and I'll use the word again, compassionate, oftentimes that will be ego-driven, which means I must constantly be
No, I
trying to break that
understand.
down.
So it's a journey,
Yes,
but the journey does imply that there's movement over time.
hopefully.
So that over time, you identify with the other as yourself, right? The walls begin to come down, or do they not?
Well, they begin to come down. However, you're not so much seeing the other as yourself because the others have egos. And hopefully I'm beginning to break mine down and helping them to break theirs down.
But they think they have ego,
Boy, do they.
but they don't.
Exactly. Exactly. But that's the key. That's why the word compassion, sort of, think of it as a pointer. Yes.
So one of the famous Buddhist philosophers a few centuries after Buddha's life, Nagarjuna, is attributed the statement that samsara is sunyata.
Yes.
What does it mean?
Yes. So let me quickly explain these terms. So samsara is the word for the world of suffering that we live in. Nirvana is, of course, transcendence, or extinguishing of that world of suffering.
And
Nagarjuna-
sunyata?
Oh, and sunyata is a form of that breaking, moving toward nirvana. But he actually does go the next step and says nirvana is
also
samsara. So yes, and samsara is nirvana. So why does he say this? Again, it's why metaphysical ways of thinking about Buddhism should always be thought of as temporary. Because if we think in this world of suffering, once I break it, I have achieved nirvana, I have made too simplistic a dualism because that means I'm freed from it and there's something out there that then continues that's the world of suffering. And the answer is no. Even that distinction is based on a duality that is ultimately a human construct. Now, it doesn't mean we don't want to use these terms. We'll use the term compassion, we'll use the term nirvana. We want pointers toward the spiritual potency, but we shouldn't think of this as a metaphysical view that there is a world of samsara out there that maybe I am achieving nirvana to transcend from, because you never break from it in that sense. When you break from it, you are actually simply still a part of it, and this is why the Buddha never really believes it, because compassion means he can't.
So is suicide impossible?
Yes, completely. So yeah, if I were to say, okay, a great way to end the suffering I'm creating is to end my life, the view is that's total selfishness. Because if I do that, I'm not ending the suffering, I come back. Yes.
Selfishness. But the question is it impossible?
Well, I can do it with this current self that I have, but I'll just come back. And I will help no one by doing it. So even with the self-immolation, that's, we could literally call it a suicide, but it's being done only in those moments when the figure in question will think, by doing this extraordinary act of protest, I will force a waking up of what is going on. Or when Gandhi's followers are literally having their heads beaten with bayonets. They're not thinking of that as I'm committing suicide. It's being done to force the British to realize the suffering of their empire. So you're forcing an awakening to suffering.
But ultimately and metaphysically, sunyata and nirvana and samsara are all the same thing.
Yes, these are human terms we give, or another way of putting it is the Buddha gives as guides to us to help us in our spiritual practice. None of this, no human language, no metaphysical claim is going to be enduringly true. These only work within the artificial, illusory world that we have created. And hence the Buddha is giving us terms, doctrines, metaphysics that will hopefully awaken us, but none of them should be seen as enduring.
So I understand that suffering would be pedagogically useful. It would help us discover these things. But could we not discover them even without suffering?
You mean realizing the suffering we're creating, you mean? Or
No, not realizing the suffering we're creating. Waking up to the strangeness of the world with all of these divisions and illusions and reacting to it as illusory, even before we engage in any struggle against it. I'm trying to separate out the metaphysical element.
Yeah, and this is a slight spoiler alert, pushing toward where we're going to be next week, but I think it'll help. So next week we will turn to Schopenhauer, who is a 19th century figure who gives a brilliant rereading of not only Buddhism, but also, as we'll see, the Upanishads. And it is a brilliant rereading, but I bring it up in answer to your question because one of the many things he will do is to push against an idea of rebirth, accordingly, pushing against any notion of karma, and accordingly, he will fundamentally shift the notion of suffering. So in Schopenhauer's, we'll see next week, suffering is my, or his, suffering, so I am trying to act to end my suffering, and his response is, I will therefore cease to try to change the world. I will go into my room and be fed by my servants, but I will create active suffering. But of course, from a Buddhist perspective, they would say, well, no, that's Siddhartha in his palace. like you are creating suffering if you're simply retreating to your room. So the way it works in Buddhism is the entire doctrines, if they work not because they're objectively true, they work as guides by the Buddha to force us to act on behalf of the living creatures of the world. So it takes out any possibility we could take the easy way out by making it borderline impossible.
That formulation puts active compassion front and center.
Precisely, and I think that's the goal. That's the goal. I think that's exactly right. So if I were to achieve nirvana, I'm being selfish, which means I can't. But I got to do everything I can to break the self. But when I do it, I will sense pure.
The option that Schopenhauer offers, for example, art.
Yes.
The overcoming of the will in a disinterested attitude towards reality.
That's right. That is exactly right. That is exactly right. Again, it's part of we'll discuss this in much more detail next week, but part of the power and danger of Schopenhauer is exactly this. You're already getting a sense of why we're reading depth next week. But I think that is exactly right. Yes.
And you would say this is true of all forms of Buddhism?
So,
or only of a species of Buddhism?
So particular aspects. So let me say a few more words about the development of Buddhism. So going back to the Bronze Age, first millennium BCE, and then these salvific religions that started emerging in the first few centuries. So I've begun to point toward the latter with Buddhism, but let me indeed say a few more words about it. So once Buddhism begins to develop, an Iron Age empire, just as happens in Western Eurasia with the Roman Empire, in Eastern Eurasia, as we'll see in a few weeks with the Han Empire, in South Asia it's the Mauryan Empire. They will pick up pieces of these religions. This happens with the Mauryan, so Ashoka becomes a Buddhist and is converted to Buddhism, but not surprisingly takes on a piece of Buddhism, as you could easily imagine. And that creates in itself a stronger form, a stronger, not perhaps the best word, but a vision of how to take this to a larger audience, a more salvific version. And that will take two forms. One is called Mahayana Buddhism, that's the self-given name, which means greater vehicle Buddhism. That's the Mahayana themselves give that name out, not surprisingly. And this is the one that will start going north and then east across the huge trade routes that begin emerging over those major centuries as these empires are being formed, for developing these huge trade routes that we've in retrospect called the Silk Roads. And Mahayana Buddhism becomes a major, major religion in these. It begins hitting China by about the 2nd century of the Common Era in the form of Buddhist icons, and then by the 4th century becomes a major force. You start getting monasteries being formed, and thereafter spreads throughout all of East Asia. And then Theravada Buddhism takes the southerly route, again, largely through the trade routes, but becomes huge throughout all of Southeast Asia. And in both of these forms, it's made in the doctrinal claim, doctrine again, put in scare quotes for the reasons I mentioned, that we are actively doing things to bring about these teachings as being possible for a larger humanity, meaning that those who actually join a monastery will by definition continue to be very few, but what are the concrete things we can do to help those in lay society begin the work? So in Mahayana Buddhism, for example, you will actually have huge temples with Buddhist icons being developed in which you have an active attempt to call on people to worship the Buddha. By worshiping the Buddha, they are beginning the work of the practices that will spiritually cleanse them of the ego and helping them achieve the path that, again, may not take form for many lifetimes if they were ever to join a monastery, but you help them on that path. It's also in Mahayana Buddhism where you start seeing these very intriguing anti-doctrine doctrines where you'll get very elaborated metaphysical claims that then the text will undercut. And the argument for doing this is to say, we are giving you a metaphysical vision that will help you, in other words, those of us not in the monasteries, help you on the path, even though as you get further along, we will, the texts are quite clear about this, and so you're not being hoodwinked, you're being told of this from day one. As you get farther, we will tell you that none of this is really true, and that's when you get the claims that, well, you're in samsara, you're trying to achieve nirvana, but by the way, there's really no distinction. And they say that very openly, which is fascinating.
But you haven't fully accounted for the difference in the psychological quality of the affect. So in Buddhism, we have these statues of the Buddha serene,
Yes.
peaceful, heavenly.
Yes.
But Christ is on the cross is anguished.
Yes.
And he cries out to God, why have you abandoned me?
Yes.
It's
Yes.
a radical difference in the character of the affect.
Yes. Yes. And those statues of the Buddha, you're absolutely right. The key for the Buddha is he has achieved, regardless of which of the stories I mentioned followed, by any of those stories, the Buddha as portrayed in the statue has achieved this absolute compassion for all living creatures. Absolute compassion. Now, either that's because he achieved it eons ago and has taken the form of the Buddha, or a figure named Siddhartha Gautama really did achieve nirvana under the tree. Regardless of the story, it's
Compassion and serenity, right? Because we associate compassion also with the opposite of serenity, with anguish. If the compassion is alive, we don't just, in identifying with the object of the compassion, we share in his or her anguish. Do we not?
We
That's
do.
not part
The only reason I'm hesitating on the term serene, and it comes back to what we're saying about these domestications. So the form, to say a few more words about what I was mentioning before, like the form when this takes in corporate America, where as I mentioned, actually literally be in corporations where you're forced to do this, you'll be asked for 15 minutes to stop your work, meditate, and then go back. And the idea is this will just calm you down and allow you to go back to work. And they'll use that word. No, but the reason I mention that is they'll say, this way you'll be more serene. And what they mean by serene is kind of, you'll be calm, it'll calm your anxieties.
And I'm not trying to attribute anything complicated. I'm just reading the physiognomy from the statue.
Yeah, but the sense, if we want to use the term serene, the serenity of a Buddha would be this pure gaze that can truly see the suffering of all living creatures. So it's not the serenity of, I'll calm myself down and return to being a good worker. It's the serenity that would come if we truly could break our ego. And looking at the Buddha, you're trying to get a sense, this would be an egoless vision of compassion. So if you want to use the term serene, that's fine, but the key is, that's the sense. It's this absolute perfect seeing of the suffering and this desire to do everything possible. Desire is a dangerous word, but this attempt to do everything possible to save us.
Our experience of this compassionate suffering is inseparable from the sense of the reality of the division of selves, right?
Yes,
We're
but
anguished
precisely.
because
Sure.
the self is real. What's
Yes.
happening is real.
Oh, absolutely. But the danger of a lot of political activity, minus this work, the sense would be, despite what we may claim we're doing, a lot of our political activity is really about us. It's really about our ego. And the sense is, if you could literally, I'll stick with these extreme examples, set yourself on fire or allow a British soldier to beat you to the point where you become literally brain dead, if you are able to do that, you are doing it without ego, by definition. Whereas a lot of our political activities would be seen as really ego-driven, which means we're not really doing it out of compassion. We're hoping it will help some people, but we're kind of doing it because we think it'll make us look good. And the sense is, no, no, no. You must literally do it to the point where, ideally, you're doing it with no ego. Now, I say ideally because, again, we're not going to do this, but this is what we're trying
Well,
to
ego,
achieve.
the reality of the ego is just one dimension.
Yes,
Because the other dimension is the reality of time, of history.
yes,
All this is real in
Yes.
a real world.
Yes.
And the struggle to transform the world is taking place in this real world.
yes.
Not in some other realm in which we're free from the sense that these things are realities.
Yeah, but you're free, but you're not. This is why nirvana is samsara and vice versa. So you aren't going to be free from the world of suffering. Even when you break the ego, it will immediately generate in you this incredible compassion for all living creatures, which will make you actively want to act on their behalf. So there's no sense that you can head off and kick back and be serene in that sense, a sort of passive serenity. I don't have to fight for my ego because I'm beyond that. I mean, Schopenhauer is in danger of that. We'll discuss that next week. But in Buddhism, no. If you are achieving this, you will be in the world doing things that the rest of us could never do because we have our ego still. Let's open this up. And as always, feel free to ask big questions or very specific questions, including specific questions on the readings or anything else. Please, yes.
In what the Buddha is doing in terms of truly seeing the suffering of others and feeling this compassion, is he or someone that state feeling intense pain?
Yes, yes. The sense is absolutely. So the descriptions, intriguingly, in all of the stories, albeit in obviously a slightly different way, they will say, under that tree, he experiences this incredible pain, first by realizing the suffering that he was creating in his world, and then when he sees that we have created an entire world through that suffering, all of us, and that this has been going on for eons. And the descriptions are he feels this incredible anguish. Now, that's certainly true in the versions of the story where he personally is achieving this for the first time. Even in the stories where he achieved this eons ago, he still is doing this because for us, we, of course, we haven't achieved nirvana yet, and that story will be a guide to us. And in essence saying, when you start meditating, get ready. It is going to be devastating. It's devastating to lose the self. It is devastating to see the world as it really is, a world of suffering. And the story of the Buddha is there to say, you are going to have, it will be devastating, you will feel incredible anguish, but you must go through this.
Now, another aspect of the moral psychology of this ethic that could be seen as troubling is the relation to the family, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The Buddha abandons his newborn child.
Absolutely, yes.
And what's the commentary on that?
Yeah. Now, let me say two things about this. The first, to underline a point I made earlier, if any of you have children and you decide, oh God, I'm sick of being woken up at 2 a.m. every morning, every night. I'm going to join a monastery and be freed from this and achieve nirvana. Again, the monk will say, no, you go back and you care for your child. Like, you will only achieve what you're being called on to achieve by developing a sense of caring for those around you. You're not spiritually ready to join a monastery. You go back and take care of your child. So the story is not told to say to us, kick back and don't deal with your societal duties. Again, a monk will say, get back and you start caring for people. However, that being said, let me get back to the heart of your question. It is the case that were we to ever achieve this, we would break from all of the social relations that we currently have. Now, we won't, so you're not going to leave your children if you have children, but that is absolutely the case. I mean, we will see in several weeks when we turn to Confucianism, as I mentioned, Buddhism will make it into China, and we'll discuss at the time the intriguing parallels and differences, but one unbelievable difference is this: the Confucians just said, I don't care how many eons, even if I were to believe in reincarnation, and in China that's not a common belief, but even if I were to believe in reincarnation, you can never leave your family. Like, if you're really going to be coming back for eons.
We see that even in Christianity.
Oh, absolutely. The sense would be you better just get really good
I've come to terms with the son against the father.
Absolutely.
Brother,
Absolutely.
brother.
Absolutely.
With a sword in my hand.
Yes. And that is part of the terrifying power of Buddhism. Now, again, not in an easy way, which is why it's terrifying. That's not saying you can leave your children, but in a terrifying sense, the sense is ultimately all of our social relations are built out of this suffering. It is a terrifying vision. Yes. Yes, please.
I think unless I misread it, the reading suggested that the oldest form of Buddhism was focused more on the liberation of the individual, and that this emphasis on compassion you're talking about was kind of a secondary development in Buddhism. Is that right?
You are quite correct that the DeBerry introduction does frame it that way. I would respectfully disagree with DeBerry. I would say compassion was there from the absolute beginning. And with all of the different stories you get about the Buddha, we've only discussed sort of 2 variations, and there are many, many more, but for all of them, the sense is the key shift is a shift from creating suffering to pure compassion. Like, that's the shift. Yes.
Well, it's there in the stories of how the Buddha became Buddha.
Precisely.
That you
All
told
of
us
them.
at the outset.
Yes, precisely. And that's kind of the heart of it. So for all of the different stories, that's always the heart. It's pure compassion that the Buddha ultimately achieves, that we are striving to achieve ourselves, even though, again, we never will, but that's exactly right. Yes, please.
What is the difference between the compassion that Christ felt and the compassion that Buddha felt?
Yes, that's a great question. Would you like to begin, or should I begin? Either way, because I would love to hear your thoughts on this too. So if you couldn't hear in the back, the question is, what is the difference between the compassion that Christ felt versus the compassion that the Buddha felt? It's a wonderful question. And there's so many dimensions to it, so I'll begin with a few, just to begin the conversation. So, and here too, there are many stories of Christianity, so as with Buddhism, one will jump across different stories, but in one version of Christianity, the compassion that Christ felt was, and I'll get back to the moment that Roberto mentioned, by that understanding, he, prior to being on the cross, felt that he was giving teachings that would help all of humanity. When he is on the cross, he feels he has been forsaken by his own father. I've done exactly what you asked me to do, and why have you forsaken me? And then the stories vary, but at some point, either there or in his resurrection, he recognizes the full story, which is that his father had to sacrifice him, and only by sacrificing him could he take on our sins and accordingly open up the possibility for our salvation.
So you mentioned
yeah,
there
please.
a very interesting distinction in these moral psychologies, which is the centrality to Christianity of the Judaic idea of sacrifice.
Absolutely, precisely.
And Judaism was just then in the period of overcoming the emphasis on sacrifice,
Precisely.
which Christ then, according to some, took on himself.
Exactly.
And he sacrificed himself So that human beings could stop sacrificing one another.
Precisely.
That's the theology of it.
Absolutely. And just to underline the significance of this, note, we've mentioned several times these Bronze Age religions. Across the board, without any exception, the Bronze Age religions were based upon sacrifice. It was based upon a sacrifice by the priestly elite on behalf of the hereditary kings, giving sacrifices to the deities that only those priests, in support of those kings, had access to. And absolutely, the move of Christianity on this regard is to say, no, all of us can stop all sacrifices because God has sacrificed his own son, but by doing so, he has taken on our sins, and now we have a path to salvation. So instead of sacrificing, calling on the support of the deities, we now have this extraordinary act of compassion, beyond extraordinary, it's almost too weak a word somehow, of a father sacrificing his own son, but therefore taking on our sins, so we therefore can follow the love of Jesus and possibly achieve salvation ourselves.
It had been already foretold in the year sacrifice of Isaac.
Exactly.
Of course, of the Moira.
Exactly. And to continue the parable, getting back to the heart of your question, so very comparable in some ways with Buddhism, but therefore it just highlights the interesting differences. So in earlier Vedic religions, the Bronze Age religions in South Asia, absolutely, they were based upon sacrifice. So the king would work with the Brahmins who alone, because of hereditary basis, could give sacrifices to the high deities. The rest of us could not, and it was through those sacrifices that the support of the gods would be maintained. So what happens with Buddhism, you get, an absolute rejection of sacrifice, and the Buddha himself does it. Now, there's no father sacrificing his son. It is the Buddha, and obviously there have been different stories of this, but in the different variations, the Buddha at some point, either during the story or in a previous lifetime, achieves that moment of pure realization of the suffering, and through that suffering begins the compassionate act, which means he, in a sense, you could say, sacrifices the self for us, but the key difference is once he has done so, it opens up the possibilities that we could do the same, even though it's given this extraordinarily difficult vision of what that would entail, but we could all become the Buddha. So in Christianity, it would be heretical, although as Roberto has said, for that reason it's become a very powerful theme, but it's heretical to say we could become Jesus. In Buddhism, that's what you're supposed to do, is to become the Buddha, even though, of course, it's almost impossible. Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
So when leading people to Nirvana, is the idea that you help free them so they no longer experience suffering, or so they no longer cause people suffering?
So it's really, you begin with the latter. So and I emphasize that because we'll see beginning next week with Schopenhauer, he will translate, and this is very common coming out of Schopenhauer with a lot of Western rereadings of Buddhism, it's often rewritten to be ending my suffering. The De Berry introduction very much puts it that way, as you've noted. So it's all about ending my personal suffering. No, in Buddhism, it's really like the reason you're doing this is because you're being forced to recognize the suffering we are creating. And once we realize that, we need to change everything. Now, when I emphasize the suffering we're creating, by the way, they mean this in a strong form. So let me begin. So they will therefore make all sorts of distinctions about the nature of the suffering we're creating. The worst you won't be surprised to hear is that the suffering we should be able to see but refuse to see. There's also suffering that we don't see, but it's almost impossible to see. So, for example, when we walk on the ground, we will step on ants and kill them. We're creating suffering. The view is, since that's not something we really could stop, I mean, if an ant is literally on top of the ground and we see it, we could stop. But if they're in the anthill and we don't notice it's an anthill, we will kill them. We're creating suffering, but that's considered relatively low-level suffering. The suffering they're really concerned about is we have created a world that is inherently based upon creating suffering from others that we really should be able to see, and yet we're incredibly good at not seeing And getting back to the story of the Buddha, that was the key. When he realized my entire life was based upon creating suffering precisely by trying to create a world in which I was happy. And the key of that story is that's what we do, right? We're all Siddhartha in that palace. We don't have kings as fathers, but we're all Siddhartha in that palace, creating a world for our ego, fulfilling our desires, fulfilling our will, our hopes for wealth, fame, and power, and that's all based on the suffering for others. And that's why you have universal compassion once you can truly see it.
Universal compassion. But to a Western moral imagination, it's strikingly impersonal. I mean,
Well, also it's literally
so we
impersonal.
discussed before
Yeah.
in relation to Christianity, the significance of the ethical idea of throwing down your shield,
Yes.
unprotecting yourself, making yourself vulnerable as the doorway to moral transformation. But vulnerability is intensely personal. It's ad hominem. Everyone is vulnerable in his own way. It's
Absolutely.
a moral secret. And this ethic points outward.
Well,
It has this impersonal. I'm not trying to judge it for the.
Oh, yeah. Oh, of
I'm
course, of
saying-
course.
I'm just saying that the character of the affect is very different.
it is, and when I say ultimately impersonal, I mean that very literally. I mean, ultimately, this is literally impersonal. We're breaking the ego. Now, it's important to note, though, we aren't there, and even if all of our work, we won't be there for many, many lifetimes. So if, for example, you're working with the Buddha is very actively trying to help you wake up to the world that you are creating, help you see how you can begin acts of care and compassion to begin this process. So in that sense, there's absolutely, despite the sort of large-scale framing, there is an incredible focus on the minuscule things we are doing in daily life that is creating horrible suffering. And that's often where a monk will begin. It's like they will begin with the basic daily mundane stuff we do and say, begin there. So ultimately, it is literally impersonal. For most of the work you would ever do with a monk, it is not at all. It's all, what are the little things you are doing as you construct a world that is so devastating to those around you?
Do you all know what the effective altruism movement is? Has everyone heard of that? So, Buddhism seems closer to effective altruism than Christianity.
That's interesting. I actually
Don't you
don't
think
agree.
so?
No, I would read effective altruism as straight utilitarianism, or a version of it. But I mean, straight utilitarianism is all the utilitarian.
There's several levels down to equality, right?
Right.
So-
Yeah. Yeah. I don't mean to imply Bentham implied anything like that ridiculous. But yeah. But I would say it's straight utilitarian thinking, though, isn't it? Whereas Buddhism is very non-utilitarian. It's not. You're not
I think
trying
it
to
is
do a calculus of
utilitarian.
benefits.
Well, utilitarianism, so according to the Christian version of Bentham is even less utilitarian than.
I agree. Like that, I fully agree. Yes. Bentham is a much more interesting figure than what the little piece of it you caught apart from. I fully agree.
Anyone should read perhaps his most interesting book, which I think no one reads, called Not Paul, but Jesus. It's a denunciation of St. Paul for having distorted Christianity in the process of inventing it. And it's in part on this very theme.
Absolutely.
Bentham wrote that?
What?
Who wrote that? Bentham?
Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, his work, Not Paul, but Jesus.
But let me, and I fully agree. I think Bentham develops utilitarianism, but it's a very different vision than the idea you get in Perfect. Absolutely. On this point, though, let me say why I'm hesitant to even use the word altruism for Buddhism. I mean, we can choose to, if we're being good Buddhists, we can use the terms in very different ways. So in that sense, it's fine. But in terms of the concerns
of
people
the
raise-
activism of it, of the instrumentalism of
Oh,
getting
absolutely.
rid of the
But-
consequences of your selfhood.
Oh, I see. Yeah. No, in a certain sense, yes. Of course, I'll mention two concerns on that. Of course, the key for effective altruism is you first must make $1 billion or whatever the money is you're trying to get which from a Buddhist perspective would involve a creation of horrible suffering. And then with that $1 million, you then do things that you decide will help people, which of course from a Buddhist perspective is like, good luck if you think after getting $1 billion, you're going to be in an ethically good position to decide how to really compassionately help people. You'll probably be doing it for yourself. But let me use that to make the larger point. I would say with an altruistic vision, and feel free to push back, but just going back to what we were saying 2 weeks ago as well, the danger of altruism, as we were discussing it over the past 2 weeks, the way Christian visions of love get domesticated into visions of altruism. Christian love, and I'll get momentarily to Buddhism right after this, but with Christian love, the idea is it is going to absolutely break our normal mode of being, to put it mildly. Whereas altruism is all about not changing anything about yourself or really anything about the larger social world. So in the standard example that we were discussing last week, so in liberalism again, every individual is their own little itsy bitsy god. They have their own domain of power, which is their property. We have things like markets and democratic governance and then utilitarian policy making that will decide what bits of our property must be given in terms of taxes, in terms of paying money for food, etc. Then, on top of that, you can have an ethical call for altruism, which would be to say, even beyond the amount I'm supposed to pay in taxes and pay for my groceries and accept as a utilitarian social policy, I will give a little bit more to help people. And again, I think it's good to give a little bit more than not, so I don't mean this is an all-out critique. However, the danger of that vision is it doesn't in any manner, shape, or form question my vision of myself. It doesn't question the social structure. It doesn't question the fact that there are poor people because we exist in a social structure that requires there to be poor people, and maybe we should rethink it. You're simply giving people a little bit more freedom. Yeah, but the reason I'm saying this is with Buddhism, none of that would be ethically acceptable, right? like if I, and let me turn to the more extreme example of effective altruism. So there, yes, I would try to become a billionaire, then give a bunch of it away to really help people. The concern in Buddhism, as I mentioned, is number one, what it would take for me to become a billionaire is probably going to be horrifically ego and will-driven, to put it mildly. But even then, once I've gained $1 billion, if I am then choosing how I am going to be altruistic, what are the chances that I'm really going to be doing anything other than something to help me, to make me look really, really, really good? Because I gave away 500 million of it. Meanwhile, I still have my private islands, but look at what I chose to give my money to. So for Buddhism, all of this would be unacceptable.
Be radical, but still literal. Andrew Carnegie says, a man who dies rich dies dishonored. So he actually did spend more than half of his life giving away everything.
And let me immediately say, Carnegie is a great example. Cornelius Vanderbilt is another great example. Vanderbilt University is a wonderful place. I'm glad he gave the money to create Vanderbilt University. Read about what Vanderbilt did to get that money. I mean, I'm glad he gave a bunch of it away, but oh my gosh, I mean, the unbelievable suffering he created to get that money to then happily give away for us. But from a Buddhist perspective, that's not the way to do it. That's not compassion. That's becoming fabulously, incredibly powerful and wealthy, and then giving some of it away. I'm glad they give some of it away rather than don't. But
well,
still.
It's the opposite of the overcoming of the will.
Precisely. The total pure triumph of the will. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, it's all about look at me and look at how amazing I am.
Not necessarily, but still a triumph of the will.
Completely. Yes, absolutely. Not surprising that brought up several hands. I'm not sure the exact order, so kind of randomly, we'll do here, here, here. Does that sound roughly right? Great, please.
So thank you so much. So I have a series of thoughts that I cannot make up my mind about, and I don't even know how to think about them. So
I think we had a better.
Oh, let me actually run up a microphone.
There is a mic here that I'm using.
Actually,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. So my question was, it's not a question, it's a series of thoughts that I don't know how to think about them. So when, I'm thinking, there must be kind of, there must be an active feeling and an active perception of pain or the active perception of suffering. But I'm thinking about the human capacity to be aware, or like, I don't know, the Buddha's capacity to be aware of the suffering of the people at all times. Like, and I'm a scholar of Islam, so I'm thinking about it like we have the debate whether God is aware of the particulars or God is aware of only the generals. So I'm thinking of the particulars of the pain, so the pains of each individual, or the pain of the generals. And then the other thing that is also overlapping with this and like where it's getting mixed up is, so as a human being or like as a God that is in a, like for some reason stuck in a human body or like is embodied in a human body, then there are certain limitations on that. But then I'm also thinking about, again, like from my Islamic learning, is at some point pain is not felt the same way, suffering is not felt the same way. And like the thing that comes to mind is the Sufi thought and how a person gets ordained and they follow a master and they have to do these kind of, they literally have to strip themselves away from life. They really have to put themselves through suffering. And they also, the worst part of it in my view is that they have to put themselves through the unknown. So sometimes the master, like there is this famous story that the master told his student to sweep the streets of the city for 7 years, and then when he went to his master he told him, no, that's not enough, go back and do it, and he didn't know what he was seeking. So I'm thinking of, like, there is this knowing and unknowing, and then there is this perception of pain, but to what extent there is this perception of pain, and then what kind of pain? Because like if you're going up the ladder to these 7 stages of becoming a Sufi master, at some point this pain is not felt the same way. Like it translates into a completely different like experience, or complete, like the brain programs it like interprets it in a different way. So yeah, this is my brain. Sorry, I'm like it's messy. I don't know how to think about it. Yeah.
No, I think this is wonderful. And yes, and thank you for bringing the Sufi material into the discussion, which is incredibly powerful. And I'll just reflect a bit back from the Buddhist way of wrestling with these very similar problems. So in Buddhism, you have a comparable set of tensions. So very much the concern is the Buddha, again, achieves this absolutely universal compassion. But again, not only will we not achieve that, but what we will achieve at best is, as you said, it will be the most mundane aspects, the little things we do that are creating suffering. And always in Buddhism, you begin there. I mean, you do not begin, the great vision is hopefully a propelling, an inspiration to move toward that, but you absolutely begin with the very common and mundane. You then slowly work out to see the larger sets of sort of embedded social relations that have been created over the centuries, if not eons, that are creating larger sufferings that we're an active part of. You begin to sense those. You begin to work on those. By now, we're talking about like the really spiritually potent, those who actually join monasteries, who can act in ways that we never could in the world because they've done so much spiritual work, that even they're concerned with things like how do we change this government from doing this person from doing that, and you're only still working toward what would ultimately be a sense of just this absolute universalized compassion. But absolutely, as you said, if we tried to start there, it might make us worse because if I focused solely on that, meanwhile, I'm not even noticing the horrible things I'm doing, even in my immediate mundane life, less the kind of social worlds that I'm a part of that are also inherently based upon the creation of horrible suffering. And so you're exactly right. In Buddhism, too, they also wrestle with these, and yeah, your way of framing it from the Sufi perspective is wonderful, so thank you.
All forms of altruism have to be selective.
Always, absolutely.
And it's just how they're selected
Exactly.
that distinguishes them.
Absolutely.
But there's still not the other idea, the idea of love.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's right. It's universal. Again, compassion, as I mentioned, it's a human word, but still, it captures something, and the capturing it's this absolute sense of what can I do to save all human beings, which again is something we would be only working toward achieving. Great, so I think it's in the back, then here, and then here. That's roughly right in terms of the order. There's plenty of time, so yes, yeah, please.
Just a question on the egoism. I mean, is it possible to argue that the pursuit of ego death is in and of itself egoistic? Only in the sense that, I mean, I suppose with the caveat that it's to help others, but isn't it possible for that motivation to be in some way egoistic? And if it is, what does that mean for the entire project?
Definitely, and so there is even a term for this. So, so the question is, wouldn't it be possible to understand the desire to rid oneself of an ego to be, and possibly the most ultimately egotistical act? And the answer is absolutely, and there's even a term for this. So those who have done unbelievable amounts of spiritual work, probably again for many, many, many lifetimes, have achieved the point where they could join a monastery and take this to the next level, where they would then be at a point where they could truly begin acting in the world in ways that would just be beyond what we could conceivably do. Such a person could be in a position to finally achieve nirvana. If they do so, they are being selfish, and they have failed totally, because the sense is it would ultimately be the most egotistical act for me to end the suffering of the world by, in a sense, running away from it. It would be the most egotistical thing I could do. And so the term they will use is that figure who willingly turns away from nirvana and returns to the world to do what is necessary, which will involve all the potentially all the unbelievably difficult things I mentioned. That's a bodhisattva. And they have not achieved nirvana, but they could have and didn't. And the sense is they can't, because that would be the most egotistical thing they could do. That would mean they're running away from helping us. And if you were really taking this seriously, you could never do that, because that would be the ultimately most egotistical, selfish thing you could do.
And it would be condemned by both a Confucianist and a Christian.
Both, exactly. I agree completely. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
For different reasons within a different vision.
Yes, but I agree. But both would, albeit as you said, for different reasons, would equally strongly condemn such a view. Yes, you cannot run away from it. That's the most egotistical thing you could do. Yes. Yes, please.
I'm curious to hear more about the idea of compassion in relation
Yes.
to hierarchies that exist within Buddhist orders,
Yes.
just between monks and nuns. And as an
Yes.
example, nuns not being able to admonish monks, but the opposite being true and
Yes.
written down as a rule given out by Buddha.
Yes,
Is it
absolutely.
not true that
Yeah.
these hierarchies would continue this cycle of suffering despite people being enlightened and recognizing the harm of this suffering?
I would say yes. So one of the things that's intriguing, and we're going to confront this repeatedly, and we'll certainly hit a bunch of this when we hit to Confucianism in a few weeks, is at what point do we, as figures who are trying to confront these ideas in their most terrifying, powerful form, at what point are we right to say, but we just think there's some things here that are just wrong, that we ethically think is wrong. And we don't want to jump there too quickly, because we want to say, let's try to understand what they're saying. But I think you brought up a wonderful example where at least I personally would agree with you totally, that there absolutely still is in these early Buddhist teachings, I mean, Buddhism has worked against this, I should add, but in these early Buddhist teachings, absolutely there are notions of hierarchy that are still embedded in these visions of karma. So if the self we create continues in the lives, and the more suffering we're creating creates certain types of beings, there absolutely are statements of hierarchies that I find utterly objectionable. Now, are there resources in Buddhism to question these? I would say absolutely yes, and of course that's played out historically. Now that this is no longer the way monasteries
Fundamental
work, but
opposition
yes.
of Buddhism to the karma idea.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so there
I mean, this
absolutely
is
are the
tremendous
teachings there.
Buddhism arose
Yes.
in India,
Yes.
and it radically rejected the caste system.
Completely. And so I mentioned before, one of the stories about the Buddha is he achieves nirvana with remainder. I'll sort of pick that and twist it a bit by saying, I would say that's an aspect of Buddhism with remainder. It's actively rejecting these hierarchies and yet fails to do so fully in its earliest form. It does, however, work out of that and works to shift it, and we will see very comparable things with Confucianism in a few weeks, and we'll get more in the 2 weeks after that to Christianity, the way these hierarchies have played out in Christianity, and how they could be rethought as well. But I think we need to confront these. That it's, when we say we want to confront these ideas in all their power, we also, I personally would say, we need to be willing to also disagree with them strongly in certain places. Yes. Yeah, it gets several hands. I think it's here, and then many, many hands. So I wouldn't even attempt to give the numbers. But yeah, let's begin here. Yes.
So I remember, so we say how once you achieve nirvana, you have to go out to the world to inspire.
Yes.
But you have to, like, being aware of others' suffering. But doesn't that cause the enlightened self to suffer if you're focusing on others' suffering?
Yes, the answer is absolutely. And so, and I'll take your insight and say, maybe we should even expand it. The suffering that you will experience will be unbelievable. This is why, going back to the earlier question, the agony that the Buddha is described as feeling when he's under that tree beginning to finally see the world. And it is incredible because you are forced to realize what you have been doing, just by the way you've been living, the incredible suffering. And then that next step, when you actively try to change the suffering, you are, and again, it's a very different sense than the sense of Jesus taking on the sins of the world, but you are absolutely taking on extraordinary levels of suffering. I mean, most obvious example being, burning yourself to death. But that's only an example. It's you are undertaking unbelievable levels of suffering onto yourself to try to save those around you. And that's part of the terrifying vision of Buddhism. The easy thing to do, needless to say, would be to say, when you're going back to that corporate office and meditating for 15 minutes and beginning to break down the self, that's a good time to stop and go back to your work. And Buddhism would say, no, keep going. And you're not going to be a good worker. You're not going to be a happy person. It's going to be devastating, and it's going to get worse.
So nirvana isn't the opposite of suffering.
Right, well, ultimate nirvana would be, but if you take nirvana, going back to the question in the back, that would be selfish, because you'd be ending suffering for yourself. And once you are achieving this level of spiritual potency, you will feel immediately this compassion to help everyone around you. Well, everyone's too limited. Every living creature. And
Are you
again,
thinking of Mahayana Buddhism or all Buddhism?
oh, actually, this is a strong position in all Buddhism. So both Theravada and Mahayana will emphasize that. So the term bodhisattva appears in both, and it's the sense of the incredibly spiritually potent figure who will decide not to achieve nirvana because it would be selfish. That would just be ending the suffering for themselves. Yeah. So I'm not quite sure of the order. I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Does that sound right, roughly? Great. So Jiajiao, please.
I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the hierarchy thing that she saw.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. So the claim that's made in Buddhism, and I'm also critical, but the claim that's made in Buddhism is that the hierarchy is normatively based upon the level of spiritual potency. So the degree to which you have done the disciplined work that would allow you to achieve ever higher levels of compassion should be the basis for the power you would have in a Buddhist institution. So in any monastery, the highest monk would be the one who would achieve the highest level of potency, not based upon birth, but I'll come back to that momentarily, but based upon the work you have done. Now, the reason I say I'll come back to birth, and the reason it comes back to the earlier question, is the view is, well, how you are born is in part a product of the self that you have created through these previous lives that ultimately you're breaking from. But there is something that's born, and that born is a creation that you had, and the sense is ideally that should be the figure in any hierarchy here that we, in the Buddhist world, are creating, should be the most spiritually potent person. But absolutely, there was in the early tradition a fallback, and gender was one of the aspects of that, where the sense would be, well, it would be a male, of course, who would be the most spiritually potent. Now, I do want to emphasize strongly, Buddhism is now strongly reacting against that. This is not how monasteries work now, and that's been true for many centuries. But there's no question, in the early tradition, there absolutely was a gender hierarchy. The sense was that the more spiritually potent was de facto seen as the male. So yeah, please follow up. Yeah.
So like, if someone's viewed as like egotistical, is there like a hierarchy of like egotistical?
Definitely. So there absolutely, if you couldn't hear, is there a hierarchy of egotism? If egotism is one of our problems, is there a hierarchy? Absolutely. So and the reason I say absolutely in that strong form is until we achieve nirvana, which again none of us would do for eons and eons and eons, we will still have an ego, and we will always be called upon to be endlessly reflecting and doing the spiritual work through things like meditation to break down that ego, because it's always in grave danger of affecting our actions in the world. And therefore, getting back to the heart of your question, those not doing this spiritual work will have a dangerously high ego. Even a highly spiritually potent figure could be in danger of allowing that ego to develop, taking the form, going back to the earlier questions too, of trying to run too quickly to nirvana. And so there's absolutely a hierarchy of, even if you're doing this, you're being told, you haven't gotten rid of the self yet. You still have an ego. You are still acting on your own behalf out of your self-interest. You just think you aren't. And so you're constantly having to reflect on that. And there are more or less dangerous ways of doing that, and there's like an intense sense of hierarchy as to how badly you're falling into that. Yes. In the senses we all are. Yes. So yeah, John said right next to Jaja. Yeah.
In the Upanishads, it says that your deepest self, the Atman, and then it's like the same as the ultimate reality, the Brahman.
Yes.
I was wondering if these identities eliminate individuality,
Yes.
or how like individuality plays a role within this.
Yes, wonderful. And so we've mainly been focusing on Buddhism, so thank you for turning this back to the Upanishads. And we will, for those of you who love the Upanishads, I do too, we will come back to it, because Schopenhauer is deeply building out of both Buddhism and the Upanishads. But getting back to your question, yes. So unlike Buddhism, which, as we've said, gives metaphysics, but they're always changing. The idea is we're going to give you a metaphysical set of ideas to help you now, but then bear with us, because we'll break them down once you get further. And they say that very openly. The Upanishads, unlike Buddhism in this regard, absolutely give us a metaphysics. And that metaphysics is the vision that there is a timeless one. Our experience of the world, of we as separate individuals, is a failure to comprehend the true nature of reality. To understand the true nature of reality, we must undergo an introspection, which will allow us to realize that our true self really is one with everything, because everything that exists really is one, and it's precisely by getting closer to that we sense this oneness. Hence, as you said, the famous statement, Atman is Brahman. So my true self that I perceive as mine isn't. It's actually part of the oneness of everything, and I perceive myself as a distinct individual because I am failing to see that true reality. And as we've seen, Buddhism in some regards is playing on a very similar set of themes. One big difference is Buddhism will say, we're not asserting that it really is a monistic world. We're simply saying, at times, we'll say that to break you from thinking of yourself in egotistical ways, but then they'll openly say, once you get further, we'll break that down too.
Pragmatic use of the metaphysic of the time.
Precisely.
And I just want to emphasize what a strange feature of the history of philosophy, as we've discussed before. The two dominant traditions in the world history of philosophy, are both opposed to the real recognition of the reality of time.
That's right.
In the West, the dominant tradition is the Greek philosophy of being, the Aristotelian philosophy, which asserts that what is most real in the world is the ultimate constituents of nature, now described by the standard model of particle physics and by the laws, constants, and symmetries of nature. That's what's real. And we understand the rest of nature from that basis, from that perspective. And the second tradition is this metaphysic of the timeless one,
Yes.
which says that all distinctions and all time are epiphenomenal or illusory, and the real reality is the timeless one.
Yes.
And these two traditions that are opposed for millennia have in common a striking feature.
Yes.
They both associate reality with the denial of time.
Yes.
And they are the alternative to the third position, which you might think is the one that would most recommend itself because it's closest to our experience, but it speaks with the weakest voice in the history of philosophy, which is the temporal naturalism, which says that everything changes sooner or later, including change itself. And nothing is less real because it's ephemeral, since everything is ephemeral.
Yes.
In other words, it breaks this equation of temporality with denial of reality.
Yes.
And it's really strange. It's a remarkably strange feature of the world history of philosophy.
Yes.
And the third position, which is the position of what you might call temporal naturalism, has very problematic formulations because its philosophers have been people like Hegel and Whitehead and Bergson in the 20th century, who introduce another figure in the equation. The other figure is the protagonist of the story, Elan Vital, Geist, and so forth. It turns out to be a Bildungsroman, a novel of formation. And that's the weak point about them, because then they say everything changes. It's like in natural history, is the terrain of temporal naturalism. The idea that there's no fixed catalog of types. The types are historical. There's path dependency. Everything are loosely linked causal sequences. And the laws evolve or co-evolve with the phenomena that they govern. That's temporal naturalism. But then the philosophers who espouse this third position, which would seem to be the one that's closest to our experience and therefore easiest to defend, take back with one hand what they give with the other, because they say there's a script, there's a narrative, which is the narrative of the formation of the Elan Vital or the Geist. And it's predetermined what forms it will take, rather than accepting that it's not predetermined what forms it will take, and that the really new is possible in the universe, that the universe can be the seed of the emergence of the new. They want to deny that the new is really new. So the third position is not the full statement of this third position, which you might expect, but a kind of bastardized version of the third position.
Yes.
That's what we have in the history of philosophy.
Yes. It is absolutely fascinating. And we will see when we get to Confucianism, you'll see a form of an embrace of temporal naturalism, but then we'll see a domestication of it that will sort of take away what I suspect both of us, and I suspect many of you would see as its most powerful formulation. So it's fascinating the degree to which what many of us would probably think would be one of the most powerful ways to build a philosophical and religious vision is the one that keeps being pushed aside. Yeah, it's fascinating. Yes. So I think in terms of order of reads here, I think you were next. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you can put it into context, the entire sort of the goal of desiring to end the
Yes. The answer is yes. And your goal is to end desire because the sense is desire comes from the self. If you were to break the self, you would break the desires. However, the key for Buddhism is the Buddha must somehow convince us to get on this path, which means he's giving these calls, these inspirations, these guidelines to those who, by definition, have a self and a very strong sense of ego, and hence the paradoxical formulations. It's trying to develop a desire for us to break our desires. Ultimately, we will have no desires, but meanwhile, we have to develop the desire to not have a desire. That is exactly right.
But there's a reason for this focus, right? Which is consider again what I call the incurable flaws of the human condition: our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability. We can't do anything about our mortality and our groundlessness. The world, we don't understand the world. We just have this little piece of light surrounded by darkness on all sides. And we can't do anything about our mortality. We want eternal life, and the history of religion and philosophy is a history of the stories that try to convince us that somehow we will have eternal life. But we think we can do something about our insatiability. Our insatiability tortures us. Can't we control it? Can't we master it? That's the central intuition that's at the basis of this idea. And it's this radically different treatment from the treatment of mortality and groundlessness.
Wonderful. Now, there are several other hands still up. With deep apologies, we won't have time to get to them today. Don't worry, because next
We'll
week...
continue. We have a
Yes,
whole other class.
Precisely. We'll be discussing Schopenhauer next week. Schopenhauer's entire philosophy is based upon a rereading of Buddhism and the Upanishads, which means all of the themes we're introducing today, we will continue next week as we look at one very powerful rereading of these traditions, and we will continue to discuss our reading of them. So many apologies to the
And
hands up.
Schopenhauer is a relentless and radical defender of this idea of the speculative monism against surprising. In the West, in the heart of Western philosophy, in 19th century Germany, a thinker who takes to the hills the view which all of Western philosophy denies.
Exactly. Absolutely fascinating figure, and fascinating for many of the issues as to why this would become so significant in, of all places, 19th century Europe. So, thank you as always for a wonderful discussion. Apologies for the hands we didn't have time to get to. Please come back to next week and raise those questions as well as the many other questions that will come up as we read this incredibly powerful reinterpretation of these traditions. Thank you. See you next week. Thank you. I know exactly. It's such a bad position. It gets me. Well, I must say, in high school, two of my favorite players were as different as you can imagine, but yet they